All right, welcome back to the Elias Macko Show, third hour of the program. Hey, who loves the Montreal Gazette? It really is an institution in this city, and boy, does it ever have a history. If you are interested in the history of journalism, if you're interested in the history of how newspapers shaped public life in this country, well, let's meet an author who has penned a tale on the Montreal Gazette. He has penned a really interesting look and a lengthy look at the history of the Montreal Gazette newspaper. It's called Fine Print, Subversive News and the Montreal Gazette, and it chronicles nearly 250 years of reporting by one of the country's oldest newspapers. It's our pleasure to welcome David Yates on the program, author of the book. David, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, Elias. Appreciate this.
And 25 years as a journalist at the Montreal Gazette, what made you say, hey, you know what? I want to write this. I want to write the ultimate history of the paper.
Well, I was at a congregation of a whole lot of journalists from the Gazette about 10 years ago, and I was talking to various people, and they said, we were really lucky we lived through the golden age of newspapers. So that got me going, and I said, I got to do something about this. It was just something that made me move.
And I do want to talk about that golden age and the heyday in a moment here. But it just, as things work out on this show, we started off the week, we did a story about Benjamin Franklin and how he tried to annex Canada some 250 years ago. And of course, the Montreal Gazette came up because he had a role with one of the founders of the paper. So why don't we start there? We'll start off with how the Gazette begins. Tell our listeners.
Well, this was just around the beginning of the American Revolution, and Benjamin Franklin, who had brought the 13 colonies together, wanted to get Canada as a 14th colony. So he got his friend Fleury Mesplet, a Frenchman, to come up to Montreal after American forces had captured Montreal and had tried to take Quebec. They were unsuccessful in taking Quebec, and they hightailed it back to Montreal and then back to the United States. But Fleury Mesplet had a big press and a whole lot of heavy type with him, and he decided he was going to stay in Montreal and not go back with the American forces. So he started a printing business in Old Montreal, and he got the church involved in it, and they were his first business contracts. And then he decided after 3 years he would start a newspaper because he had all the accoutrements that he needed. So he started the newspaper, and he hired a man named Valentin Jotard to be his editor. And that didn't work out so well after a year because they were criticizing everything that they could that came into their sites, including the British colonial authority, the church, and the court system. And these guys were arrested less than a year after they started the newspaper, and they were thrown in jail for 3 years. So that put an end to the Gazette. It got off to a bumpy start.
Well, and one of the things that comes pretty clear after that bumpy start, one of the threads of your book, it just seems like the Gazette, it's intertwined, public opinion, politics throughout the years. I know there's a lot of nuggets that come into the book about that intersection, but let's talk a little bit about that. What struck you as you were doing research and looking at the paper and the paper's history? What do you think are some of the tales that deserve some highlighting on the air here?
Well, the newspaper had shook up the establishment in 4 different centuries. And the first time was Fleury Mesplet's going to jail after the criticism of the local institutions. But the next one comes along in 1849 after the paper became an English newspaper rather than a French newspaper. And the owner was a guy named James Moyer Ferris, and he wanted to, he was very critical of a bill that was going through the legislature of the 2 Canadian provinces in Montreal. That's where the Parliament building was. And he encouraged people to gather to protest this bill, which was to compensate the French-speaking rebels who fought the British in 1837 and 1838. So this mob that gathered in Champ de Mars moved to the Parliament building at Place du Ville, and they broke in and they started a fire there. The fire chief threw a brick at a clock, and it hit one of the gas jets that supplied the lighting, and that started the fire that burned down the Parliament building and burned also 20,000 volumes of records of the colony. So it was. Could you imagine if the federal Parliament were still in Montreal today? What kind of a city Montreal would be?
This is why I loved your book, because I think you can make reading your book. You can make the case that if the Gazette never existed, the history of this city, this country, is totally different. So it's pretty incredible when you go through it over the years.
Okay, so the next time, Elias, was during the 1930s when Duplessis was in power and came to power. He came actually in the 1940s, but before him there was Camille Yaoud, who was the mayor of Montreal, and the Gazette played a key role in having Oud arrested and sent to an internment camp for 4 years during World War II because he encouraged people in Montreal to defy conscription to support the Canadian forces in Europe. Jeez. And that was an incredible thing to do. And the actions of a couple of people on the staff, on the Gazette staff, made this happen. In fact, one of them was Tracy Luddington, who was the city editor, and then there was Abel Weinberg, who was a close friend of Duplessis, and he was the Quebec correspondent of the Gazette, and he stayed most of the time in Quebec City. But both these guys were on the Duplessis payroll, and they helped out during elections of Duplessis. In fact, all the papers except one were supported Duplessis during the 1840s or 1940s and 1950s. The Toronto Star owner, J.W. McConnell, in fact gave cash to Duplessis to fight two elections, 1952 and 1956. He gave them in shoeboxes full of bills. The first shoebox contained $50,000 for the earlier election, and in the later election, he gave Duplessis $100,000. And the reason these newspapers supported Duplessis was to keep the price of newsprint down. Jeez. And he kept the price of newsprint down by reducing the cost of cutting rights for the big pulp and paper companies.
David, listen, obviously, we always have time limitations here, but I want to spend some time on the heyday, the golden age. So let's talk about that. Tell us about your take on when the Gazette was at its greatest peak.
The heyday started in probably 1968 with the first investigative piece that the Gazette did by Brian Stewart, who later became a star foreign correspondent for the CBC. And then it moved into the early 70s, and they were just coming off at quite a pace. The Gazette won two major awards for having a look at the protest over the Van Horn Mansion on Sherbrooke Street, and a developer bulldozed it, much to the chagrin of heritage people in Montreal, and new laws came in protecting the old buildings of downtown Montreal to protect them from becoming taken over by big investors and bulldozed to make parking lots. The next one was a series of stories by Henry Aubin, who actually found out who owned Montreal by looking into records and who owned the 100 most expensive buildings in Montreal. He did a great job. It took him 18 months to do it. And there was another one at that time. It was done by Gillian Cosgrove, and she went into a girls' juvenile detention center and found girls handcuffed to concrete beds and left there as a discipline measure, and they were left there in their menses and urine and other things that we don't want to talk about on radio.
I'll tell you, just reading about some of that journalism that was done by the Gazette was some of the stuff I enjoyed the most in the book. The other thing that I really enjoyed, because you got into like sort of the newspaper battles in this city. There's a section where you talk about, the Montreal Star, the Montreal Gazette, everyone trying to say we got the highest circulation, that kind of stuff. Can we just talk a little bit about that, about a time where the Gazette had some competition in the city, at least on the newspaper front, and what that era was like for the paper?
Well, it was very tenuous getting toward the end of the Montreal Star's life, because the Gazette was on shaky ground financially. It was starting to get to the point where it started off the 1970s in a pretty good position. It was making money, but by 1976, it was losing money. And the owners in Toronto were unhappy, so they dumped or they let the contract expire of a publisher and brought in Ross Monroe, who was a big war correspondent hero for Canadian Press, and he was supposed to get the paper off the ground. But fortunately, for the Gazette, the Star went on strike. And the pressmen went on strike, and they were on strike for 8 months, and that pretty well did the Montreal Star in, because all the readers and advertisers deserted it. The paper wasn't loyal to them, so they decided not to be loyal to the Montreal Star, and they shifted over to the Gazette. The Montreal Star strike eventually ended, but the readers and the advertisers did not return to the Montreal Star. I made the mistake of quitting the Montreal Gazette just before that and joining the Montreal Star. It went on strike. I was on strike for 8 months, and we came back for about 9 or 10 months, and the paper closed. And we all got some severance pay out of that, and then we had to look around for jobs.
David, there are so many great stories told about the history of the Montreal Gazette in your book. I'm going to recommend it to all of our listeners here. If they want to seek it out, it's called Fine Print, Subversive News, and the Montreal Gazette. David Yates, a 25-year veteran of the paper, is the author behind it. David, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks very much, Elias. It was my pleasure.
I'm Dylan Playfair.
And I'm Tyler Smith.
We're putting loneliness in the penalty box by talking to some of our favorite athletes about the importance of friendship.
This is Bromance.
Bromance is brought to you by Charm Diamond Centers, proudly Canadian-owned and operated. Charm has been part of your love stories and bromances for over 50 years.
And you can find Bromance on the iHeartRadio network or wherever you get your podcasts.